Okay, fine. Okay, everyone, welcome to this week's PCDN Career Chat. We are delighted to have you joining us again, whether this is your first time or you're coming back again and again. Let me just double check and make sure recording's going. So this week, I'm Craig Zelzer from PCDN from Medellin. We have Catalina Rojas from PCDN from Medellin. And then we are very excited to have as our guest this week, Ruth Freedom Pojman, who is one of the world's leading experts who has been working on human rights, international relations, trafficking prevention, engaging the private sector and supply chains and many other sectors. If I read Ruth's entire bio, we'd be here for the whole session. So I'm just going to summarize a few things. And then Ruth will give us an overview of some of her career recommendations for 10 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So Ruth is an independent expert with over 20 years experience working on preventing human trafficking, illicit trade, international relations, conflict prevention. Over the past few years, she's advised business and governments and organizations, including the Ethical Trade Initiative, the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, the International Labor Organization, Windrock International, Globe Security, OECD, RUSI, and the U.S. Institute of Peace. She's also done election observing for the OSCE, and she serves on a number of advisory boards and steering committees. For over 10 years, she was the deputy and senior advisor at the Office of the Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings at the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the world's largest security organization. She can tell you about it. She also served from 2002 to 2008 as the first senior advisor at USAID on advancing sound policies on combating human trafficking, both within the US government and with counterparts. She's also worked for the IOM, worked across Central Asia. She's worked on raising awareness around refugee rights, political asylum, and Central Asia in many places. So again, that's just a very brief summary. Ruth is joining us from Vienna, Austria, one of my favorite cities in the world, and definitely has some of the best pastries. So Ruth, I will turn it over to you, and thank you so much for taking time to share your expertise.
Well, thank you, Craig and Catalina, for organizing the PCDN Impact Career Chat every week and for inviting me today. It's an honor to join you, and I'm a big fan of yours, Craig. I've known you and known of you for a very long time. You are the best networker I know of in the world. If I was asked anyone, I think you're one of the most, connected persons doing good in the world. So congratulations, and to Catalina as well. You're a great team. And thank you all for joining from all over the world, as I understand. I've watched a few of the Impact Career Chats, so it's really a pleasure to meet you virtually. And I'm going to try not to talk more than 10 minutes, I hope, because I really want to have more of a discussion. And I think that's much more interesting to get questions and answer your questions, so that hopefully I can be useful to you in your careers and also learn from you during the discussion, because it always provokes interesting thoughts to myself, because you don't stop learning or growing at whatever age you are. To start with, by the way, my middle name is Freedom, and I can talk about why I was named Freedom and what that means in the Q&A, but I didn't get too far away from my name in life, and I started my career in a way as a teenager. I was, like Craig, involved in conflict prevention, in particular the prevention of nuclear war, and I had nightmares as a child about nuclear war. And so I, as a US citizen, I felt a responsibility to do something personally. And I got involved in citizen diplomacy and people-to-people programs and educational exchanges already as a teenager, and started learning Russian. I didn't really know where I was going with that, but I felt that was a cause I wanted to do, just like many young people today probably think about also preventing different conflicts in the world which are proliferating, or the urgency of climate change and addressing these urgent issues on our planet that affect us all. So I started off without a career path. So I was nonlinear, as the title of this chat is called. And unlike many careers that you may want to have in life, which I didn't know where I was going, there were no clear steps for me. So it was kind of a trial and error and a zigzag career. If you look at my CV today, it may all look very obvious where I was going, but going forward, I didn't know where I was going. So just if you don't know what you're doing, of course, you should try and do research and figure it out. But at the same time, I think you can follow your passions. And to me, the most important thing was to act in keeping with my values and to keep following my interests and passions. And then little by little, I developed skills, whether they're language skills, whether they're, taking a risk and going into the field and working. So I actually got one of my first jobs by showing up in another country on the ground. Actually, this has happened to me twice, and doing informational interviews. So I think when you are an entry level, when you're starting off in college or grad school, there are many, many, things you can do to start your career, even though as an entry level career, you are, there are many, many people competing with you in a certain sense. And so sometimes I think that when you go to the field, if you can afford it, and if you are willing to take that risk, you can get a job of higher responsibility in the field than sometimes in capitals and in headquarters, for example. Also, as in one career chat, one lady was talking about how she started off volunteering. If you can afford to be a volunteer, an intern, and so forth, that's a great way to get not only a foot in the door eventually, but also kind of, for me, it was a process of elimination, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So I tested this, I tested that, I interned here, I volunteered there. So in a way, I also learned by doing, and also learned what I didn't want to do through doing. Informational interviews and networking, I think PCDN is a great resource, not only, for job seekers, but also for fellowships, for information, for training, for support, coaching, CV support. So all of these things are very important. Once you are mid-level, then it gets harder. I think the higher you go in your career, or the further you go in your career, the harder it is. And once you're mid-level, it's very important to keep your skills up, to follow trends. It's also very important when you apply to a job to make sure that you put in your CV keywords of your experience, because sometimes there are even apparently computers that are looking at online applications and kicking out applications that don't have enough of the keywords that relate to the actual vacancy. And again, doing your research, doing your homework is very important, making sure you don't apply for things that your skills, don't fit. That's also very important, not just applying for everything out there, and also don't give up hope. As the DevEx talk a few weeks ago discussed, there more and more organizations and agencies are looking at diversity, for example, or looking at hiring people in the field from a local community. And there's a trend that people are hiring people who they don't know. It's not just who you know or word of mouth, though that can help sometimes, especially to get some more information on whether this is a good fit or not. And then at a senior level, maybe something we could discuss later, not that I have all the answers to this, is that there's a lot more politics at the higher you go. There's a lot more stress, especially if you're both managing up and down. And so I think you have to consider that a part of your job description is stress management. And then since I am currently a consultant, I wanted to say that it's not the end of the world if you're not in a full-time job. I made the conscious choice to start a small business and to be a consultant. I might go back to having a full-time job, but I'm really enjoying it. And you have to balance life, your kind of work-life balance, as they say, in a different way, because you don't have paid holidays, you don't have benefits, you have to plan yourself. But at the same time, and you have to keep looking out for things and responding to emails and writing proposals and so forth. But at the same time, I find you have overall less stress, and you have more flexibility in the end. So yeah, the main thing I think also in general is to be professional, to believe in yourself, and if you're willing to take risks, there are more and more organizations now. Also, I heard it's a trend from DevEx as well, that there are more and more contractors and consultants, and less maybe full-time, long career, stable jobs today. So it never hurts, even if you do have a full-time job, to have a backup option that you're developing skills and that you're able to do something else in case your job becomes redundant. And these days, I know, unfortunately, a lot of people who've gone through hard times. So it's always good to have a backup on your backup option with your own skills and talents.
So thank you so much, Ruth. For people who just joined us, please put in the Zoom chat where you're zooming in from, any key questions you have. And Ruth, that was a really good overview and lots of good tips. And I think Catalina and I will start each with one question, and I could ask 100 questions, but since I've known you, I will not abuse that. And then please put in your questions in the chat. And if someone wants to make a longer comment, you can raise your hand and then we can call you and we can turn on your mic and your video. So Ruth, just one question. So we often have university career counselors here too. So you have Russian skills, you have international relations skills, you've worked for multi-laterals, bi-laterals, NGO. So just like for people who are just starting in their career, like you've talked about really developing skills, like how important was it, like how important was your linguistic skills in terms of Russian? And like, so how would you advise people like to balance regional knowledge, sectoral knowledge, and linguistic knowledge to kind of build their career at like working across sectors?
Well, I do think that in this day and age, though, I am privileged to be an English speaker. I have an advantage. And unfortunately, in some international organizations, you find people who only know English. I do think that language skills are really crucial if you want to go into international development work. I think it helps you not only communicate better with people in different countries, and it also helps you understand cultures, and it also earns you respect. Even if I don't speak a language so well, the fact that you're trying to learn at a basic level conveys a lot of respect and affords maybe dignity to the culture or person that you're talking to. Not to say that you can't operate without a language, because if you work with a lot of countries, you can't, unless you're a genius, you can't learn all the languages, but still it really helps. And I've worked in a lot of different sectors, as Craig said, and it wasn't that I had a plan to do this. And I do think when you're younger, you can enter any of the sectors, wherever there's an opportunity. So if you're interested in working for USAID, you might be lucky enough to become a presidential management intern. I'm just talking about a US example. If you're in another country, if you're interested in going to the Foreign Service, there usually are exams, or there's processes throughout the world to enter development agencies in countries that have them. On the other hand, there are NGOs all over the world, both international and local NGOs, and sometimes those are easier to get into. The private sector also, it's easier to start off in an entry, and the United Nations internships and junior professional officer programs are entry points, for example, besides just applying for jobs when you have the skills. I think when you get older, it is harder to transfer from one sector to another. So at some point, you know, I went from working for an NGO, a government contractor, to the private sector, then to the United Nations, then the US government, and then a regional international organization. And now, say, for example, I wanted to work in the private sector, despite the fact that I did work in the private sector and I've worked with companies in my last job. It's not easy because a lot of companies they may be more interested to have someone who has a long history of working in their company or with companies than someone external. Or so transferring the further you go, unless you're, you know, a celebrity or you have some extraordinary expertise, sometimes it does get harder to move from one sector to another later in your career, but it's not impossible. And I know people who've gone certainly from a government to the private sector and vice versa, and from, you know, NGOs to government and vice versa. So it is fluid, and I think in these times, you know, I think the world is becoming more fluid, and there will be less and less people having long-time careers only in one sector. If you're open to different opportunities and you're interested to try and address issues from different vantage points, or, you know, to have the big picture from different vantage points and do multi-stakeholder work.
Thank you so much. So Kata's going to ask the next question, and the questions are starting to come in. So we'll please everyone put in your questions and comments. So.
Yeah, we have, hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who just joined. We are in the Q&A portion, and as you know, we love your interaction and your input. So I have a couple questions. One from someone attending, Samar, and then I'm gonna drop my question as well while you formulate yours. So the question from Samar: are there any paid UN internship opportunities where age is not a requirement and even people near 40 or higher can join?
Samar, that's a good question, and I honestly don't know the latest, but I was in touch with an ex-colleague of mine at UNHCR recently, who I know was trying to work at least on the payment issue, because internships used to be paid and then they were not paid, and now I think some internships are paid. And for example, at the OSCE, at least, this was 2 years ago, we were at least trying to give some payment to internships, at least for, say, housing or transport or something, so that it wasn't completely non-paid. And having worked on human trafficking issues, you know, though I also worked in unpaid internships, it would be nice if all work was paid, at least at some basic level. And in terms of the age limit for the UN, my sense is that there are age limits, and that this is more for people who are, you know, but actually some internships at international organizations do mention, for example, that you should be in graduate school, and don't necessarily mention an age. So that's something either you can look up or I can try and find out about afterwards. I don't know the latest. I know that there was a discussion again about whether this was fair or not, and whether the UN could offer some payment again.
Yeah, Samar, I'm gonna provide you what I know. I think internship, the reason why there might be some age limits is because there were mechanisms created for entry-level professionals to insert themselves in their organizations. But I didn't want to leave you like that, and I encourage you to look at fellowships, because while there might be fellowships with age restrictions, I think that the universe of fellowships can provide you with no age limits and can give you sort of that experience that an internship might give you. And I'm going to ask my question, and then I'm going to pass it on to Craig again because he has some questions for the audience. First of all, Ruth, you remind me, I host the Social Change Career podcast, and like exactly your presentation was the type of conversations that we had in the podcast about you, like the process of your career trajectory. So I really deeply enjoy that. And you mentioned languages. Craig, follow up on that. So language, one skill. What are, in your opinion, a couple more skills that have been very useful in your career, considering that you've been in so many different sectors? But what are those two other skills that you have carried with you that have served you well in your career?
Thank you for that question as well, Kata. One of the main skills that I've had is in communications. So I've never been a journalist, but I worked a lot with media in my life, and I worked in some positions that were communications or public information positions. A lot of that was writing. So I think to have good writing skills is very important, to have good communication skills, to have listening skills, which is a part of also being able to communicate well. And to be able to communicate to different kinds of audiences. You also learn communication skills, speaking skills. I've had a little bit of training, but I also learned by doing. And I'm out of practice now because I'm not doing it so much this year. You have to keep up these skills. It's not easy. Just because you learn something doesn't mean that you have it always there at the tip of your fingertips. And I think also the more languages you speak, sometimes the harder it is. Like I've been speaking German most of the time recently, so now I'm it's funny, sometimes I try and think about what is the word in English for this or that. So communication skills, I think, are very important no matter what you do, writing and speaking. Like I said, if you're going to be in an international development job, I also think that cross-cultural skills are very important. And I did study cross-cultural communications. I was lucky enough to go to a graduate school, the American University, which had such a program, but at the same time, it's once again something you can read about. Now, there's so many resources online. And then, of course, once again, learning by doing. And just because, for example, in job descriptions, it may say one of the requirements for this job is the ability to work with across cultures and to be multicultural. And that's usually in the United Nations and in international organizations, there's this requirement. However, just because I know how to work with, say, just hypothetically, French people because I speak French, or German people and Austrians because I speak German, or Russian culture or something like this, doesn't mean I can work with people from Egypt or from Finland or from Nigeria or from Thailand, so, but still, I think when you have a toolbox of being aware of cultures, it helps you. And so in a way, one skill is also looking at yourself and trying to see yourself, because it took me a very long time to see certain things about the way I acted in international settings. That was very much also about where I'm coming from culturally, despite having grown up as a third culture kid in several countries. And, just sort of toning down a little bit of this, and emphasizing something else, trying to learn what is appropriate or not appropriate in different situations can not only show respect, but it can also help you avoid a lot of problems. But nevertheless, inevitably, you'll run into situations that you won't have read about, that you won't have experienced, and you just have to get through it and and learn as you go.
Thank you so much, Ruth. So lots of questions are coming in, and a bunch of people have joined us. Nice to see you again, Jana Hara. So I think just to say, we have Colombia, the US, Austria, France, Bangladesh, a couple other countries. So let us know where you're zooming in from. And for people just joining, I'll just say one more time, let us know, put in the chat box, and feel free to put your questions. And if you have a longer comment, just raise your hand and we can turn on your mic and your video. So Ruth, thank you so much. The next question is from Alexis, who maybe is somebody you know, Alexis Aronowitz. How do you advise young students who have just graduated with a bachelor's to enter the market? Many jobs require work experience, which students may not have. So is it all about volunteering? It's that catch-22 we talk about all the time of employers want people to have experience, but often they don't provide the pathway to get that experience. So how do you like get around that?
Yeah, I don't have an easy answer for that, Alexis. Thank you for your question. I actually advise quite a lot of students. People write to me, and sometimes I'm asked to give talks directly to a class, for example. And I do try, even though I'm connected to a lot of people, to at least, if somebody writes me, try and give one tip to them or one lead or something. And I try also to repost PCDN posts and other jobs that I see out there. However, of course, to get in at the outset, if you want to work in something, it is very difficult to get a break. And at the same time, I know, people who have volunteered, who have interned, who have been a junior professional officer and so forth. It was very difficult to get that first break, but once they got something, then, they decided maybe even to do something else. So I found personally going to the field, as I already said, was very useful. Trying to develop, maybe you have a full-time job where you're getting paid, but then you do some volunteer work in your spare time. Maybe you realize that a certain opportunity, you need to get very specific skills that you don't have. And if you really want to go into a certain organization or a certain space, I do think that it's possible to get in, but you have to be very strategic and really focused and really work hard on it. And of course, I suppose there are people who, who don't get the break. Unfortunately, right now, also, the world is not so easy in this COVID time. But if there's a specific, if there's a specific question about a specific organization, then I think it's also good, as I said, to do informational interviews and try and get in touch with people, say through LinkedIn or through PCDN or some other network, and try and get an informational interview to also find out whether, some more information about how can you get in. I remember also in my last organization, there weren't a lot of entry-level positions. There are more kind of lower mid-level positions than absolutely, say, in the UN session, you say P1 positions. So this is also something. At the same time, I've seen so many people get the break because they kept at it. They didn't give up. They kept applying. They kept improving their skills. They kept, volunteering. And sometimes, I do know people who've worked 2 or 3 jobs just to be able to afford one that was, in internships or a job that that paid, really, not enough to live on, let's just say.
Okay, thank you so much. And just to say, we do periodic LinkedIn workshops here. So there's a whole art and kind of science to using LinkedIn, and we'll probably do one maybe in a month or two, because a lot of people do not use LinkedIn, right? It's not about finding a job, it's about building a network. So that's a whole so the next question comes from Danielle, and people, when you're asking questions, just let us know where your question, like where you're based. So Danielle has 2 questions. Thanks, Danielle. The first is, from your perspective, how necessary is a graduate degree? So if you think about your peers or when you've hired. And then the second question, you touched on some, but how do you think COVID-19 is affecting the job market? And how can we overcome that in terms of both job opportunities and networking?
Thank you, Danielle. Nice to meet you. So about an MA, it's a good question. And actually, I'm sure Craig has even better answers than me. I can say that in international organizations, MAs are listed as requirements for senior and executive positions. Government also sometimes, well, certainly it helps, and certainly in the US government it helps. However, I think more and more organizations appreciate on one level the actual skill set you have, that, for example, you continue to learn, say you have a BA, and then you continue to learn, and you have a mixture of experience, skills, maybe continuing education that you can do online. So I think more and more it's not necessarily necessary to have an MA unless you are planning to go or maybe right away. I think there is something also to going to undergraduate school, then taking some time off, trying to get some experience. Then you can go to graduate school, but it can go in any order. I personally found going to graduate school to be very useful for me professionally, also because of what I learned. And I also really I learned who I was actually in graduate school through taking some courses on cross-cultural communication and conflict mediation and things like this. I really understood a lot about my life, and I was able to really get into depth in areas from international development to international public law, which helped me get the job, have the knowledge, and be able to have the conversations that I had to be able to get jobs sometimes. So I find it very useful. At the same time, it is I think more and more possible that there are more and more jobs, I should say, that don't require it, and that require more skill sets, and then maybe also your personal strengths and talents. In terms of your second question, I also think it's too early to say maybe Craig knows more from talking to people about their careers in COVID. From people I know a lot of people, an amazing spectrum of people who've lost their jobs this year, or who are underemployed right now, and who are of course very nervous about what will happen, even if I have a friend who works at a bank, for example, and I was very surprised when she said to me she seems to have a great career. Well, actually, Ruth, I want to learn some of the skills that you have in starting your own business and becoming a consultant, because I want to have this backup option. And she's my age, with a kid, and so she's like, I'm nervous that I could become redundant, and so unfortunately anything can happen. And I do think also, I remember as a child, my father always, he kept applying to jobs even when he had a job from time to time, if he saw something interesting. And once he actually, needed this backup option. So the world today is in some ways, really open and wonderful and connected. At the same time, there's a lot of uncertainty today, and not everyone is able to afford to take some of the steps, or it has such an appetite for risk as others. So yeah, I think it's tough to say. Personally, I have developed a new skill set this year. I have developed a skill set in e-learning since the world has gone online. So I think that, there's a way to reinvent yourself, or, to refresh yourself, building on the skills you have and learning something that you will need today. So so you may not right now be able to go into the field and in certain places because of COVID, and other times maybe because of other diseases, or literally because you can't travel right now. At the same time, there are a lot of things that you can do online at the same time. So, but I'm, as I said, I don't know everything about what's happening. So I'm happy to learn too.
Thank you, Ruth. And I think your response is, I was just thinking, this is exactly why we decided at PCDN to do these weekly chats, because it is such a stressful moment for people losing their jobs, for people afraid of losing their jobs. And this is why we want to be with you every week, to sort of bring you people like Ruth and amazing professionals to sort of keep helping each other and keep answering some of the questions about this tremendous uncertainty that we're living right now. So, thank you for being, this is a space that we should consider safe for all of us to ask our questions and support each other, and recognize that Looking for a job is hard. Looking for a job in the impact space is even harder, but we're not that alone and it is possible. So thank you for being here. And we have the next question from Cristiana Lavinia. This is a very, very interesting question. Is it wise from a career perspective, Ruth, to intern with international organizations even when you are overqualified, like over the 3+ years professional experience? But is that a good strategy for getting a job, to intern with an international organization?
I'm sorry, the name again?
Name is Cristiana Lavinia.
Christiana, thank you for your question. That's a good question, because there's a lot of issues around qualifications and levels that you're at. I have applied for a few jobs in the last 2 years, and I've been told that I was overqualified and overexperienced, for example. And so at the same time, I have seen people get jobs. I have hired people who are overqualified for their jobs, because you want to get the best person for a job. And I think the same thing is with internships. I was in an office where we also hired interns, and I think we looked at a mixture. So every hiring manager, every office, every organization is different. But sometimes, you know, if we saw that we're going to have a program on X and we have this internship candidate who has those skills and many skills and is more qualified than another person, sometimes we may try and choose this intern among others. A lot of internships, because they're also 3 to 6 months long, you can have a mixture of interns during the year, some who are more qualified and more experienced, and others who are who have talents and knowledge that are more based on their education and their writing, for example. In fact, I think it is possible, though. Again, it always depends on the hiring manager and what they're looking for. You even have people, unfortunately, hiring managers who can at some point be, they not only trying to fit exactly into a job description and say that, you know, it should be between this and this much years or education or what have you, but once in a while, you know, humans are humans, and sometimes people also don't want to be in competition with people that they hire who they think are, you know, overqualified, and they want them to, they're also maybe afraid that they will get bored in the position, and you know, that they won't want to do a job, for example, that is actually at a lower level than they're applying. So this can happen at every level.
So thank you so much, Ruth. The next question comes in from iPhone, so we don't know the person's name, but maybe we'll put that in. So I think it's a professor. They have some students looking for internships at the UN and OSCE. Beyond filling out the formal application process, should they reach out to their national missions? Like, do you recommend they reach out if they're applying for the OSCE, you know, in Vienna or a field mission? Should they reach out to the OSCE mission and try to kind of work around the system, or they always have to go through the formal channels? And the person is Natalia. Thank you, Natalia.
Yes, that's also a good question. And I do think that on one level, you simply need to apply. On the other hand, it's, going around the formal channels, again, it's a balance. Just like when you apply for a job, the very senior level jobs do get quite political, and it is important to, if you're applying for a high level job, to inform your country's delegation to that organization that you're doing it, even if you don't want their overt support. For example, I applied to a position this year that was honorary, and though though some people were nominated by their government because it said independent, I applied myself. But in other situations, it helps a lot to have your government back you. At the same time, you don't want your government to go overboard. I've also been in offices where you see that a certain government puts too much pressure, and that can backfire. So when it comes to also, internships and so forth, yeah, it doesn't hurt that it doesn't hurt to call the HR department if there's a contact, or to talk to someone in the office. But I wouldn't be pushy. I would say simply, we're happy to provide a recommendation. We'd like to inform you that we, that this person is a good person. They're very qualified. They're really passionate about this. It would be great if they had the opportunity to be interviewed, or something like that. I think a lot of times it's just getting that break to get on a short list and to get interviewed, and then you can prove yourself.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. So a follow-up question. I've done election monitoring, as well. So one thing, can you demystify, particularly for the OSCE, like what does it mean to be seconded? What does it mean to be contract? What does it mean to be a local hire?
Yes.
Let's say for Americans, like if you want to work for the OSCE, often you have to go through state department, but often you have to go through PA Global. So just like demystify a little bit for whether people are Americans or not, like how do you actually, not for internships, but how do you actually get hired, and what are the options?
Yeah. So for example, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where I worked for 10 years, has contracted posts, it has national posts, it has admin posts, and it has seconded posts. And seconded posts are when actually you're nominated and you're financially supported by your government. So I was nominated by the State Department through the Pacific Architects Engineers PAE to the OSCE, where I worked 10 years. So I was actually seconded that whole time. And I actually have to say that there are pros and cons of being seconded versus contract. You're on shorter contracts. There are many differences, but at the same time, though I was not reporting to the US government, I also felt the support of the government, and that was actually, there were times when that was let's just say that was a very helpful thing, as well as the opportunity also to work with other secondees. And right now, actually, I'm working with the United States Institute of Peace on e-learning modules for US secondees to the OSCE, including election observation secondees. So, and unfortunately, in the OSCE, less and less countries are able to afford to second secondees to an organization, except for in the field where there's where the organization provides a per diem or a DSA to staff in the field. So what's not good about secondees is it can be a very unfair system. Scandinavian countries tend to pay quite well. Some countries don't pay at all, and you just live on your per diem, the daily lodging and food allowance, basically. And to be an election observer, that's also, I can't even actually tell you exactly how you start this, because I started, again, by being in the right place at the right time in the field when there was an election. And I volunteered. It's voluntary. You don't get paid for it, but you get all your expenses paid for, unless you're a long-term observer and you build up experience. So you start off as a short-term observer, and usually if you are coming from somewhere else, it's like a week to 10 days. Like the last election I observed was the Russian presidential election in a remote place in Siberia. And I was altogether in Russia for 10 days. And first of all, you have to get on a roster. And in the case of the OSCE, you have to also go through a training. You have to go through an online training. And then you have to take a test. And now it's going to be more interactive with quizzes as you go along. And other countries like Germany also have very robust secondment training programs like the US government does. And then the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights also has its own roster. So some observers come from their governments as secondees, and also some apply directly with ODIHR and are and go directly through ODIHR to the field, especially those who are long-term observers who play certain roles. And of course, there are people who have built an incredible experience in election observing, and OSCE is only working with 57 countries, but of course other election observation organizations observe elections all over the world, and the OSCE also and other organizations are going to be observing, for example, the US presidential elections, and there are people already on the ground as long-term observers. And the long-term observers, they are paid. It's not a well-paid job, but they are paid. And there are people I know who actually basically have made a career of being working in election observations. And it's certainly very interesting and very important in terms of trying to, support and maintain democracy in the world.
So just one follow-up. Thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful. And we could do a whole episode just on this hiring process. Just the one comment I want to say is, like, whenever you're applying for jobs, you have to understand the industry, where the money comes from, who gets the money, what kind of the chain of like the money and how it flows. Because lots of people apply for jobs, they don't understand the organizations funded by the World Bank or USAID. So that is one of the most important mistakes I see people do. They just apply for a job without understanding the system. So thank you so much. So Kata's got the next question.
Can I just jump in a second?
Yeah.
I also have learned a lot about recruitment and interviews. Just so if there's any, I don't know everything, but I learned a lot. So if there are some questions very specifically about this, I could probably give at least a few tips.
So a question that came from Jessica, I guess for both Ruth and Craig, because I honestly don't know, but what are good places to check for election observer mission advertisements?
Well, if you're in the OSCE space, I would look at ODIHR, but there's many parliamentary assemblies, the European Union, I even know NATO has some election observer capacity. So it's the PACE, Parliamentary Assembly, and I don't remember all the acronyms because I'm not an expert on election observation throughout the world, but there are a lot of, I would simply, depending on, I would start off with, OSCE, PACE, United Nations election observation, and then, I think that's a question in terms of outside of the OSCE region. I'm afraid I don't know so many organizations, but there are probably in most regional organizations some kind of election observation capacity. And then of course there are also NGOs which are observing elections, or in the former Soviet Union there's the CIS election observation. So there are different regional organizations that have a capacity in the region that they are mandated to operate in.
So just to make one comment, a lot of people who want to work in kind of global social impact, they want to go from like no experience to monitoring elections in some distant country. Whatever your field is in, it's often better to do things locally. So be like a poll worker in your home state or city.
Yes.
And then get, so that you can get that experience, and then you can try to move to other places. But if you're in the US, you've got to go for OSCE, got to go through Pacific Architect and Engineers, and then do the test, which I've done it. So I did election monitoring in Bosnia. But anyway, so back to Kata.
I'm going to ask my question, and then Emily wants to hear some of your tips for interviews. But I'm going to put my question first because you, both you and Craig were talking about seconded and the Scandinavian governments. And I noticed that a lot of us here in this conversation are born and come from the Global South. And you're not from the Global South per se, Ruth, but you've worked all over the world in very international settings. So what specific tips or what suggestions and ideas you have for professionals from the Global South to insert themselves in jobs in international organizations or to have a career of impact in general?
Well, Thank you, Emily, for that question. One interesting thing, having worked in the United Nations and in the world's largest regional security organization, the OSCE, is that geography does play a role in hiring practices. So most of the international organizations have, I don't want to say quotas, but there are countries, even if you look in the UN system, it will even say, for UNODC or ILO or some UN agency, there will often be a list somewhere actually of the countries which are underrepresented currently, either in the United Nations itself or in that particular United Nations agency. So that's very explicit. They actually list the countries, and a lot of them are from the global south. On the other hand, some countries you might be surprised to see, say Norway, Sweden, or the US, because it also has to do with the level of contributions from a government of that country, and whether there are a certain amount of staff from those countries. And then I would say in the OSCE, I don't want to use the word affirmative action, but just say it is a little bit like that if all things are equal, and I have somebody, there's no Tajik in the entire organization as a staff member, except for in the field, and there are 5 candidates and the top 2 are X and Tajik, for example, in the OSCE, the Secretary General, the highest person in the organization, actually has the right, it's a part of his job description to make a decision also to say, this country is underrepresented. We're going to give this person an opportunity because they are qualified and they're also from an underrepresented country. So I think that also plays a role. And then, yes, I have a friend right now who comes from a certain country in the global south who's been trying to get a job. She's applied, she's very qualified. She's just applied for 12 jobs and didn't even get interviewed, and it's very frustrating. And now she asked her, sort of similar to what Craig mentioned earlier, she actually asked her government if they could send a letter about her, not for a particular position, but just mentioning because they are an underrepresented country. And I do know that certain people from certain countries are very frustrated, who are somehow in between the Western developed countries, as they say, and some of the countries which are in the global south, for example, in Eastern Europe, because they feel like they kind of fall in between also these spaces. So sometimes those countries also feel, I don't know if Colombia is one of them too, but there are countries that are kind of in between. They're not one of the countries who are considered the development countries, and they're also not the developed. They're transition, they used to be called. So sometimes people feel like there are, there also, say, regional, there's rotating regions for high level, the UN Secretary General is now from Europe, and, there was, before from Africa, from Asia, and so forth. So, but sometimes there are countries that feel like they struggle more than others, kind of falling in the middle. Their country doesn't provide enough funding. They're not on the United Nations Security Council. They don't have political clout, but they're also not like a underdeveloped or South country that somehow maybe they're not on that list, for example. So those people can also feel frustrated.
And thank you for that super complete answer and giving us all that information. And just in closing, that was my question, but Emily's question, and I think it's a fabulous question to start closing our conversation. She want to know, me too, actually.
Oh, sorry, it's your question, sorry.
It's okay. Emily and I can share it. It's okay, I hope Emily doesn't mind.
Yes.
But her question is, if you mentioned some of the tips for interviews, so if you can share with us, what are some of the most important tips for a successful interviewing process?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And thank you, Kata. So yeah, it's interesting. When I was younger, I interviewed a lot, And I never really knew anything about interviewing. I would just, try and answer the questions and be honest and so forth. And then I found out, becoming a hiring manager and doing a lot of interviews from the other side, that interviewing is really an art. And there are people who are so good at the interview and the whole kind of knowing how to, knowing this kind of art of interviewing and so forth, that they may not be as good as you in performing the job, but they know very well how to sell themselves in the recruitment process. So getting skills in the recruitment process and interviewing are really, really important. So I'm so happy that PCDN is doing, has offering not only these career chats, but also very targeted ones, like you said, about how to use LinkedIn and, inviting DevEx and so forth, or HR professionals from different organizations. That's really wonderful. I can say in terms of what I have seen, and this is again, for international organizations, though I do have experience interviewing also in the private sector and for governments, but I would say in the UN and international organizations, there is kind of a, not a formula, but there's certain things that are always going to be there. And one of them, maybe the most important thing, is that you have to look at the actual vacancy announcement, because most organizations, they have a rule that you can only be asked questions that relate to the job. And actually, when, say, I'm a hiring manager and I have, say, 6 candidates that I'm interviewing, all of these candidates will actually be asked exactly the same questions. And so, for example, at the outset, you will have a question usually about, and this is something that you can definitely prepare for. Why are you motivated? Why are you interested in this job? Basically why would you want to have this job? And also why you need in this question to answer, why basically should we hire you? And I think it's very good to prepare an answer that is that has, say, 3 points, and that you say, 1, 2, 3, and that you basically, take your experience. You don't just regurgitate what's in your CV, but you try to say, why you fit this job and also why you're motivated. And of course, you can say more than 3 things, but make sure that you also have a message that people can remember. And then I have to say, in this age, in this day and age, I haven't seen an interview questionnaire yet that doesn't have a question about gender. And now it might be broader on diversity. So it's always important. You might literally be asked, what does gender mean? And you need to be able to answer this. Then the meat of there are 2 other most important building blocks of the interview. And one is technical skills. So you have to be able to answer questions that relate to skills and requirements of the vacancy. So for example, I'm an expert on human trafficking. I'm applying to the office of the Special Representative and Coordinator on Combating Trafficking in Human Beings. And I will be asked, for example, could you please tell us about the trends currently in human trafficking in the world? So then I would have to be able to describe, for example, the research that's being done. The UNODC has a biannual report, and the ILO estimated and then the U.S. annual trafficking in person report hasn't publishes anyway. And there are different organizations. And you explain what the trends are. And then there will be another very specific question maybe about the organization itself, to make sure you understand that you've read the website, and that you're able to ask questions which are in the public domain, basically. And then there's always what they call a set of competency questions, because they also want to try and find out through an interview as best you can in a very short time, what are your strengths and weaknesses, and are you the kind of person we actually want working in this office? And the UN and OSCE actually have a competency question framework that you can find, and you have to really, really go through it and actually practice all the different questions and what your answers could be. And you should be able to come up with each question with a case, ideally a story, a case from your real life experience, which doesn't make you look bad, but also shows that you have experience and that you're not perfect, and you learn, and you've been in different situations. And at the very end, there's also the possibility to ask questions. And usually it's good to be able to at least have thought of one question to ask. That is what my overall tip would be.
So thank you so much, Ruth. That was a brilliant kind of condensed version that I wish everyone applying for jobs, particularly at multilaterals or bilaterals, would be aware of. So maybe we can actually edit that into a clip. So we could go on much longer, but we've taken enough of your time. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your energy, and all you do to advance change in the world, both at the systems level, but also sharing your wisdom with other people. So I put Ruth's LinkedIn profile in the chat so you can find her there. And then just to let people know, next week we're doing our first ever career meetup. So it'll be online. We're probably going to be on Zoom, but I'm still looking for, it'll be getting to know each other and just totally informal. So we might try a couple of new platforms, but it'll probably be on Zoom. On the following week, on the 22nd, we have an expert in venture investing in developing countries who works at a fund that has $500 million under investment. So that'll be interesting. And we've got all sorts of amazing people coming up. If you ever want to propose a person, topic, organization, or yourself, just email us. Our next edition of our podcast comes out tomorrow with the coolest dean in the world. I mean that seriously. Dean Patricia Marquez from the Kroc School at San Diego. And she is brilliant, hilarious, fun, and insightful. And then we just launched our YouTube series. You can find that. And so thank you so much, Ruth. Have a wonderful evening. Please eat some. Thank you,
Craig, Kata, and all of you for joining. And I wish you all the best in wherever your life and professional career take you, and stay healthy.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a great evening, afternoon, morning, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth.
Bye-bye.